The fifth process in risk management is plan risk responses. This is when we develop options and actions to enhance opportunities and to reduce threats to the project objectives. Risk responses should be appropriate for the significance of the risk, cost-effective in meeting the challenge, realistic within the project context, agreed upon by all the parties involved, and owned by a responsible person. The plan risk responses process presents commonly used approaches to planning risk responses. The inputs for this process are simply the risk management plan and the risk register, both of which you are already familiar with. The tools and techniques, however, are certainly unique to the plan risk responses process. When it comes to tools and techniques for the plan risk responses process of the risk management knowledge area, we first have some strategies for negative risks or threats. If there are negative risks, any of these three response strategies can have varied and unique influences on the risk condition. You should choose the strategy that best matches the risk's probability and impact on the project's overall objectives. So the three strategies for responding to negative risks are avoid, transfer, mitigate, and accept. Avoid. This strategy involves changing the project management plan to eliminate the threat entirely. The project manager needs either to isolate the project objectives from the risk's impact or to change the endangered objective. Some examples of this include changing the project scope, removing the requirements, or the most radical would be shutting down the project. Transfer. In this strategy, we shift the negative impact of a threat along with the ownership of the response to a third party. An example of this would be a contract with a third party to do some portion of the project work or ensuring our hardware and network. Mitigate. This strategy is for a project team to lessen the impact and even reduce the likelihood of a threat's occurrence to an acceptable threshold so that the project can move forward. Some examples of this might include adopting less complex processes, conducting more tests, building a prototype, or choosing a more stable supplier. Accept. The risk acceptance strategy can be used for negative risks or threats, as well as for positive risks or opportunities. For negative risks or threats, the strategy frees the project team to decide not to acknowledge the risk unless it occurs. It means that it is either inappropriate or impossible to change the project management plan to deal with a risk, so we can respond to the risk passively by accepting it, documenting it, and leaving the project team to deal with it if it ever does arise. We can also respond more actively by accepting the risk, but establishing a contingency reserve that includes amounts of time, money, or resources necessary to handle the risk if it arises. For example, suppose you are working on a project where you are upgrading all company desktops from XP to Vista, and we know that we have some old printers that may not work with Vista. In this case, we decide to accept the risk and create a contingency reserve, which we will use to buy new printers if needed. So those are the strategies for dealing with negative risks or threats. But how about some strategies for responding to positive risks or opportunities? The responses I want you to consider here are exploit, share, enhance, or accept. Exploit. When we use this strategy, we seek to eliminate any uncertainty associated with a particular upside risk by ensuring that the opportunity does happen. For instance, a project manager might assign his most talented team members to decrease the time and increase the quality of the result of the objective or project. Share. This strategy is to share or allocate ownership to a third party who is best able to capture the opportunity for the benefit of the project. An example of this is joint ventures or mergers. Enhance. If we can identify the key drivers of positive impact risks, then we can increase the probability that the positive impact risk will occur. We can enhance our opportunity, for example, by adding resources to an activity so that we finish early. Accept. Accepting an opportunity means being willing to take advantage of it if it comes along, but not actively pursuing it. There are also some contingent response strategies which describe the specific actions that will be taken if the risk occurs, and these actions are carried out at the time of risk occurrence. A contingency plan is developed in the planning process for the identified risks, and it clearly defines the specific actions to be taken when a risk is about to happen or has happened. For example, you plan that if the rain falls, you will cover the construction materials that are kept in open ground with a plastic sheet once you see the cloud movement. You further added that if the rain starts falling suddenly without giving any prior sign, you will bring in the blower and/or vacuum pumps to dry the wet materials after the rain stops. This is different than a workaround because the strategy is planned in advance and is a proactive approach. Secondary risk is a new risk that arises as a direct outcome of implementing a risk response. Basically, if you plan and respond to a risk that you have identified in your risk register, and it results in a completely new risk, for which you may also plan a response for, it is a secondary risk. In other words, a second or new risk arises. Residual risks are those that are expected to remain after planned responses have been taken, as well as those that have been deliberately accepted. These are risks that still show up as active in your risk register after you have taken your planned risk responses. You simply are not able to eliminate the risk and it still remains in your risk register. Whenever you see the word residual, it means remaining risks in your register. Workaround is a response to a negative risk that has occurred. A workaround is not planned in advance of the occurrence of the risk event. A workaround is a solution to an unanticipated problem and is often seen as something that is designed to be a quick solution to an immediate problem. For example, suppose you are working on a project and you attempted to send an email with a large file attachment to a project team member. For some reason, your email has exceeded its space limit and you cannot send anything. Your workaround is to ask another coworker to send the email out on your behalf. Known unknowns are known risks handled by planned risk responses process. So when we say known unknown, it means it's an identified risk and it has a probability of occurrence and may have an impact, but we do not know its real probability and its real impact yet. Since we have identified the risk, we can then determine the best response if it happens. Unknown unknowns are unknown risks handled by management reserves. It means that it's not identified yet at all. An unknown unknown is outside the scope of the risk process. While it remains unknown, it cannot be managed proactively. If it becomes known before it occurs, then it is a known unknown risk, and therefore is a risk that can be managed proactively through the risk process. Once the risk happens, it will be handled by management reserves, which are funds set aside for unplanned changes to scope and cost. Fallback plan. In general, a fallback plan is an alternative in case a certain approach fails. However, a fallback plan differs from a contingency plan. A contingency plan documented in the risk register will be used when an identified risk is going to occur. Fallback plan is used when the contingency plan has been carried out but is not effective. For example, if you want to go to Stanford, but you also apply to Georgetown in case you do not get into Stanford, this is an example of a fallback plan. Best of luck! Expert judgment is, of course, also a tool and technique for the planned risk responses process, because it's important to obtain input from knowledgeable parties pertaining to the actions that should be taken on specific and defined risks. Likewise, the outputs are similar to the preceding processes, in that we want, of course, risk register updates, and take note of this: risk-related contract decisions, since one of our planned risk responses could be to hire a third party to do the work. Therefore, we would need a contract drawn up for this work. This is a decision then that we have made, or a planned risk response.